The US president tries to woo the Philippines away from China, but protesters say he's ignoring human rights abuses. I'm Imran Gata, and today's newsmaker is Donald Trump's charm offensive in Manila. Donald Trump does not have the best reputation as a diplomat, but it's good to remember the schism between Washington and Manila started with his predecessor. At the time, Barack Obama took a hard line against the drug war in the Philippines, calling it a human rights disaster. And President Rodrigo Duterte publicly swore at him. Since then, the Philippines has been pivoting towards China. And now it's Trump who's offering to make peace. At this week's ASEAN summit, he crooned about the great relationship between the two countries, with no mention of the nearly 4,000 Filipinos who've died from what many call extrajudicial killings. So, is this the price the US is willing to pay for influence in Southeast Asia? Here's Yvette McCullough.
Is this a budding bromance that will help pull the Philippines' gaze away from China?
Uninvited upon the orders of the Commander-in-Chief of the United States.
And back to its long-standing ally. US-Filipino relations soured when former President Barack Obama criticised Duterte's violent war on drugs, which has killed thousands of people. Duterte responded by calling Obama, and he's increasingly cozied up to China since. But relations have warmed under Trump, who has in the past praised Duterte for doing what he called an unbelievable job with the Philippines' drug problem. And as Trump and Duterte met on the sidelines of the annual Association of Southeast Asian Nations Summit in Manila, there was no mention of Duterte's questionable human rights record.
We've had a great relationship. This has been very successful.
But some argue that Duterte isn't good company for the US to be keeping, and that it shouldn't be embracing a strongman just to keep his affections away from China. The ASEAN summit was the final leg of Trump's marathon tour of Asia. After campaigning on an America First platform, there was speculation he would reverse the Obama administration's pivot to Asia, leaving the region open for China to dominate. But his rhetoric throughout this tour focused on the Indo-Pacific, seemingly not a slip of the tongue, but a calculated effort to counter China's influence.
So we want our partners in the region to be strong, independent, and prosperous, in control of their own destinies, and satellites to no one. These are the principles behind our vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific.
The dispute over the South China Sea is one of the region's biggest sources of tension, and one of the main areas where the tide of the Philippines' foreign policy has turned towards China, with Duterte agreeing to halt work on the islands there and pushing for de-escalation. Now Trump has raised his hand to act as mediator.
We've had a dispute for quite a while with China. If I can help in any way, I'm a very good mediator and a very good arbitrator.
Has Trump's tour of Asia sent the message that the US wants in or out of influencing the region? And has he done enough to win over Duterte? Yvette McCullough, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Manila is law professor Joy Batong-Pakal. He used to advise the Philippine government on maritime issues. And in Hong Kong, we have Joseph Cheng. He's a political scientist and democracy activist. And Jeff Smith joins us from Washington, D.C. He's a South Asia Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation and author of Asia's Quest for Balance, China's Rise and Rebalancing in the Indo-Pacific. Gentlemen, I thank you all for joining us. Joy Batong-Pakal, can I begin with you first? And of course, we're going to be talking about the US and Philippines bilaterally only initially, and then we'll broaden it out into other things such as the South China Sea. Compared to when Obama was president and you had Rodrigo Duterte saying things like son of a, whatever you want to call it, and the tensions, this is a good time for the US and the Philippines, isn't it?
Well, yes, certainly it's a marked change in attitude on the part of President Duterte. And I think it's more directed towards the leader rather than the country itself.
I see. Very interesting. Jeff Smith, is it all about the leader? Has Trump put on the charm offensive when it comes to Duterte? Do the two men seem to be compatible?
Well, the optics of the relationship certainly seem to be a lot better, and if it's not just about the leader, then that's not such a bad thing for the U.S. and the Philippines either. You know, the Philippines regularly polls as one of the most pro-American publics in the region and frankly probably in the world. And the U.S. is very highly regarded among the security establishment and large sectors of society. So the rift in U.S.-Filipino relations that began under President Obama and President Duterte was leader-driven. The optics at the leader level seem to be much better now, but I think there are also still very strong people-to-people bonds and military-to-military bonds in the relationship.
Joseph Cheng, geopolitically, is the United States trying to drag the Philippines back into the U.S. orbit and away from China?
Certainly so. The United States under the Donald Trump administration now wants to demonstrate that it is interested in the region. It intends to strengthen relations with its former allies and partners and so on. There is obvious an intention to demonstrate that the United States would like to play a very, very important role in the region in competition with China. On the part of Beijing, obviously, it understands this intention of the Donald Trump administration, and it is very happy, at least, that the Duterte administration doesn't want to pursue the Permanent Court of Arbitration verdict on the territorial dispute.
Right, and we're going to broaden it out into the South China Sea in just a few minutes' time, so bear with me. But let me ask you, Jay, as we try to understand Duterte, because Duterte is a bit of an enigma when it comes to the rest of the world. Can we say that he is anti-Western but makes exceptions for the likes of Donald Trump because Trump is a maverick?
Well, I think it's more personality-driven for President Duterte because, after all, he himself is a populist president. So he tends towards populist leaders like Trump. And I think really it's also part of the politics that he has been involved in local politics here in the Philippines. It is very much personality driven. So we're seeing this being reflected basically on the international stage.
Jeff Smith, a lot of civilians, a lot of innocent people have been caught up in the Philippines drug war. Human rights groups, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and others have documented what they call extrajudicial killings. A lot of people would have wanted Donald Trump to bring this up. He did not, and they both Duterte and Trump seem to have a plan for this anyway, even if it was brought up. Have they both decided that it's not worth the trouble for them both to talk about this at all? Well,
if you look at President Trump's trip more broadly, I think with the exception of North Korea, which he did ding on human rights in a very prominent manner during his speech, human rights has not been a central focus of his discussions, whether it's with President Duterte or President Xi. His public remarks in general, in both bilaterals and in his broader speeches, have not placed a great emphasis on human rights. But Secretary Tillerson and others in the administration have emphasized that in private and behind the scenes, the human rights issue has been a point of emphasis.
Yeah, Jeff, would you say that the fundamental core of what Trump was trying to achieve in this trip was to build as broad an alliance as possible with regards to North Korea and hoping to get the Philippines on board with that as well?
I think there were, frankly, a lot of objectives, and I think we have to broaden it out beyond the Philippines if you want to talk about the fundamental objectives of the whole Asia trip. I think North Korea was certainly a significant focal point, but there was also, I think, a particularly meaningful meeting of the quadrilateral dialogue, an assembly of the United States, Japan, Australia, and India, exactly 10 years after our first attempt at forming a quadrilateral among the four Indo-Pacific democracies fell apart. So there was a meeting on the sidelines of the ASEAN summit among those four. So there were, I think, several themes and objectives with the trip, and building a coalition against North Korea was certainly one of them. And building a coalition around the idea of promoting a free and open Indo-Pacific was a second important objective, and I think there were some meaningful steps taken in that regard.
Joseph Cheng, let's talk about the South China Sea. Trump saying, with regards to the South China Sea, if I can help in any way, I'm a very good mediator and a very good arbitrator. Do you think that's true?
Well, traditionally, China believes that it should only deal with the countries directly involved in territorial disputes on a bilateral basis. And with regard to the regional security, it accepts that it has to deal with these issues on a multilateral approach. But it certainly considers that the United States is a power external to the region. And I think it has already just expressed reservations about the mediator role on the part of the United States. I think this proposal actually comes quite as a surprise to the parties concerned, and China didn't exactly expected this proposal.
Yeah, Joseph, given that many of the other countries consider that China has been cheating by establishing facts on the ground, by having its own 9-dash line, by those military bases that it builds on the islands, is their position that China is cheating going to be strengthened if the United States tries to mediate between them and the Chinese? Does that make it more difficult for China?
Chinese leaders and the Chinese people probably think that territorial issues are non-negotiable. However, Chinese leaders understand the importance of avoiding a military conflict or avoiding any serious escalation of tension, and that explains why it is quite eager, in fact, to establish confidence-building measures type of agreement with the American government. It doesn't quite believe that a code of conduct agreement is to its advantage, and so it accepts this as a matter of principle, but has been adopting delaying tactics in arriving in concluding such an agreement.
Jay, has the Philippines' claim on the South China Sea been strengthened or weakened after Trump's visit?
Well, I think the situation in the South China Sea is still the same, because despite the atmosphere of friendliness and cordiality between the Philippines and China, obviously the facts on the ground are different and the challenges still remain. Just a few months ago, there was a big issue over a cay near Pagasa Island, for example, and that presented a particular problem. And that really is just a manifestation of the ongoing tiff really on the ground. No? Even if diplomatically and officially everything seems fine, when you look at what's happening at sea, we still are encountering problems with China, with its forces moving around in the South China Sea.
Yeah, Jeff, we're hearing that China is guaranteeing safe passage for all nations using the South China Sea, also willing to work with ASEAN to maintain peace in the strategic waterway. That's what they say. Is that encouraging, or do you not believe them?
Well, our concern has always been with freedom of navigation in general, but specifically with regard to freedom of navigation for U.S. military vessels and military vessels of other countries. While China is correct in that it has not challenged freedom of navigation for commercial vessels, it has done so for U.S. warships and airplanes operating in the South China Sea legally under the rules and designations of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which America has not ratified, but the United States has always upheld the maritime jurisdiction delineations, which suggest that the U.S. is free to operate in international waters and in the exclusive economic zone of countries in certain conditions. And our main concern has been Chinese attempts to prevent the U.S. and other warships and aircraft from operating legally in these international waters. And there have been several prominent incidents of unsafe intercepts, confrontations at sea. Just last December, China very brazenly seized US Navy underwater drone, which was operating in international waters even beyond China's 9-dash line. So that was concerning, as have a few unsafe intercepts that have been conducted this year. But our focus really has been on freedom of navigation for military vessels, which is why you've seen the Trump administration take a more concerted approach to freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea.
Mm-hmm. Joseph, those are fairly well documented and I guess warranted concerns from the US, aren't they?
Yes. Well, China understands that it is in no position to challenge the American naval superiority at this stage. It believes that time is on its side with regard to the balance of power between the two major powers. It accepts freedom of navigation, and it is in no position, in fact, to protect the vital sea lanes from the coastal provinces in the east to the Middle East. However, it is certainly building up its power projection capabilities. It is creating artificial land on the islands that it has been occupying. And it certainly would not like the United States to challenge what it claims as territorial waters and exclusive economic zones based on the islands that it occupies in the Spratleys and the surrounding areas, including the Paracels as well.
Jeff, would it be better then for the United States to deal directly with China here rather than trying to position itself as a mediator between China and everybody else who has a claim with regards to South China Sea? Why doesn't it just come out frankly and say, hey, listen, it's about our military vessels. We want safe passage. We don't want you interfering with us. It's between you and us. Why does the United States have to come in as peacemaker?
Well, I don't know that we are coming in as peacemaker. I mean, President Trump's comments were simply that I'd be happy to offer my services as a mediator if you want it. And if you don't, that's fine too, was the implication. The freedom of navigation issue is a bilateral issue between China and the U.S. And in fact, this is our one articulated national interest in the South China Sea, something that we will work to uphold vigorously. Whether or not the Philippines and China reach an agreement on the arbitration award is something that we have an interest in and we're concerned with, but is not in America's national interest, is not what China would call a core interest. Freedom of navigation is, and that's where we're going to maintain our focus.
Okay, let's go super broad again. And Jay, let me ask you about the pivot to Asia. Donald Trump doesn't like to be associated with things that were started by Barack Obama. He's always tried to distance himself from things that Barack Obama started. But undoubtedly, with him being in Asia, it seems as if it's a continuation of something that was started by his predecessor. The pivot to Asia, it has begun, maybe it has happened. What has the Philippines gotten out of it? What's of value to the Philippines, given that the United States is taking Asia and East Asia particularly more seriously?
Well, I think for now it's really just a kind of reassurance, no? Because after all, American interests in the Asia-Pacific and within this region have historically been, consistent. It has a long history, even earlier than Obama, and now that interest will continue even after Trump. So it's just that the optics and the presentation of the leaders and the particular implementation, that's the one that changes, over administrations. For now, because of the pre-established rapport between President Duterte and President Trump, it seems like that has provided some measure, again, of reassurance that at least that consistent policy will remain. No? But on the other hand, you also have to contend with President Duterte's attempt really to come closer to China, his own so-called pivot to China. And what we're going to see, I guess, in the future is how he tries to balance these two forces that he's trying to establish some kind of equidistance between.
Joseph Cheng, is Washington's pivot to Asia invariably going to crash into the Chinese dragon?
Well, there is a lot of competition, but at the moment, China's basic approach is to contain the differences and to develop the common interests, because China understands that it is in no position to challenge the United States at this stage. It needs time. And it probably understands that in the eyes of most countries in Asia, the Donald Trump administration remains unreliable, or at least rather unpredictable. We see in this trip, Donald Trump has been trying to repair relationship with, say, Japan, South Korea, and so on, because Japan certainly was disappointed with the abandonment of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and both Tokyo and Seoul were not very happy during the election campaign when Donald Trump criticized their lack of adequate commitments or financial burdens, responsibilities in paying for the American troops stationed in these two countries.
Jeff Smith, very finally, the Middle East is a mess. The United States has been trying to extricate itself from many of the issues there. Should it be focusing more of its foreign policy objectives beyond trade? I mean, when it comes to actual foreign policy and the politics, the dirty game of politics, should be focusing more on East Asia?
Absolutely. I think East Asia is becoming the nexus of trade and geopolitics and security issues, but not just East Asia. Really, you know, a term that you've heard a lot more in the recent weeks is the Indo-Pacific. Mm-hmm. And I think the U.S. government and strategic analysts are increasingly looking at East Asia and the Indian Ocean region as one kind of interconnected geopolitical, geoeconomic space that is in many ways at the crux of global politics and global economics. And I think this shift in focus toward the Indo-Pacific that you saw begin under the Obama administration will continue under President Trump and under his successors, because the strategic logic on the ground dictates as such, and American national interests dictate as such. That doesn't mean we're going to be abandoning the Middle East or Europe, but it means that this part of the world is going to be occupying an ever greater share of our attention.
Well, Trump has promised a major statement on trade, probably on Wednesday when he's back home, especially after that APEC summit. We'll be watching and listening closely to what he has to say. Maybe he'll announce it on Twitter. Gentlemen, it's been good to hear your thoughts. Jay Patong Pakal, Joseph Cheng, and Jeff Smith. Thank you very much for joining us on the Newsmakers. Still ahead on the Newsmakers, gold miners set fire to government buildings in Brazil. We debate who's to blame. And the US and NATO are sending 3,000 more soldiers to Afghanistan, but military commanders aren't happy about it. Brazil's government is facing a violent backlash after trying to crack down on illegal gold mining in the Amazon. A task force burned about 30 boats near a protected forest reserve. 2 days later, protesters torched environmental officers. But the question of who's in the wrong here isn't so cut and dry. Officials accuse the miners of decimating parts of the Amazon and polluting the rivers. And the gold miners, they say they've been denied licenses for years, while major corporations are easily granted permission. Well, to discuss this, I'm joined now in the studio by Ambassador Paulo França. He's Brazil's Consul General here in Istanbul. And Vinicius Mariano de Carvalho. He's a professor at the Brazil Institute at King's College, London. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Paulo França, good to have you back on the show. It's interesting because we're not talking about the hard politics in Brasilia today, but this is fascinating because you have the army and the police on the one hand, you have illegal miners on the other, you have indigenous peoples being caught in the middle. Is it a worrying situation?
It is, but at the same time, it's something that the government is dealing with a lot of care and a lot of determination, because illegal gold mining has a number of negative implications as far as health is concerned, as far as the deterioration of the environment, as well for the lives and for the culture of the Kayapos Indians, who were the ones that were, in fact, subject to this latest event.
They say the illegal miners, the garimpeiros, or I don't know if I'm saying it right, but they say that they can't get licenses. So the mining companies easily get licenses to operate, but they cannot if you're a small player, which then pushes them to do illegal gold mining. Is there some truth to that?
No, I don't think so. I think that legal mining has spread out as something which is very negative. As I said before, the way they enter into land which is protected, the way they use the land, the way they pollute the environment, has showed to the Brazilian government that we have to act.
Right.
We have to act with a very determined way, in a very determined way, with the cooperation of all the agencies involved.
Right.
Environment, National Indian Foundation, police, the army, all the key players to curb this kind of operation, which is illegal.
Vinicius, the Environmental Protection Agency's buildings being set on fire, so this is no joke. I mean, it's getting increasingly violent. Thousands of people have protested as well. Who do you blame for the current impasse?
It's not a simple question to answer. You cannot blame directly one or other side of the situation. Mining in the Amazon is historically a very complex issue involving many actors, as you mentioned before. We have here indigenous people, we have here the local population, we have here the presence of the state as agent to manage this environment, this area. What is also a complex area, considering the location, considering all the conditions around. The question is, as I mentioned before, the illegal mining in the Amazon, the garimpeiros, the presence of garimpeiros, and the violence connected to it, it's very historical in Brazil. And I agree with the ambassador that just said that it's important that the government act firmly in order to tackle the situation as this one that just happened here, to assure the presence of the state, the sovereignty of the state over this area and over the miners that we have in all this part of Brazil. Also to assure the security of the population living there, especially the indigenous people that share a large part of this territory as their reserves. So it's not so easy to say who to blame about that. We need to take into consideration the several actors that are involved on it, but again, reaffirming the sovereignty of the state, of the federal government over these areas, and assuring that when and if mining will arrive, it will be under the surveillance of the state and under the rules of the state.
Yes, Vinicius, given what they're mining for is a prized commodity, and also that there's so much violence that springs from it, some people are calling illegal gold mining the new cocaine of Latin America. Is that accurate?
Illegal gold mining had waves in Brazil, basically. We should remember, for example, the end of the 80s, when we had a massive illegal gold mining in a region called Serra Pelada in Brazil. Of course, that's a sort of dream of become rich quite easy and quickly, especially considering how easy it is to extract gold in the Amazon. A massive migration happened that has serious consequences for the environment, for the distribution of land in the Amazonian areas. It is a process of making very easily somebody rich. But we should remember, differently from the coca that's based on plantation, gold it is a resource that disappears very soon when we have systematic exploitation of it. So if we don't manage that quite carefully and precise, what we can have is a massive internal migration, lots of crime and illegal acts associated with that, and consequently destruction of the nature, and just after a very short period, a region completely impoverished because of the end of this resource as a
Ambassador França, this flared up again in the summer, and the timing is interesting because it happened not long after President Michel Temer signed this decree. There was about 46,000 square miles of protected areas that he opened up to commercial mining. They then walked it back and said, actually, this is protected area. But did he make that initial mistake by setting the machine in motion, by declaring commercial mining open on protected land? Was that a big political mistake?
No, I don't think it was a political mistake. I think that what happened was that in Brazil, as you know, we underwent a very strong crisis, which was deeply damaged the accounts of the country, the economy, and we are facing it, and we have to work on it. So the president is trying to bring back investors and creating a good environment for investors to the country. In this framework, he thought of this possibility. But of course, you know, there has to be a debate in Brazil, and there was a debate, and he listened to this debate and how to move forward. The question here is, the illegal miners have been doing this for a number of years, are degrading the environment, are intruding in indigenous land, and creating a number of difficulties. And there the government has to act in a very strong and determined way. As Vinicius Mariano said, and I agree totally with him, it's not a very easy subject. It's very complex. Nowadays, there is an investigation going on. As you rightly said, on the 24th, there was this operation done by IBAMA, FUNAI, and other agencies to destroy a number of equipments that were being used by the illegal gold miners. And in retaliation to that, they set fire to agencies in the city of Humaitá. So these are people that are doing criminal acts, and they have to be curbed. In this regard, the government is doing a thorough investigation. And one thing which is very important in this regard is the fact that the servants, the civil servants in those two agencies were threatened.
But I'll tell you what's interesting here is that thousands of protesters are backing the miners. Tell me why. If what they did was so wrong, right, the illegal mining, right, they have their boats and they try to get the gold out of the sludge, right, in the rivers and so on. And the government cracks down on that. They burn down government buildings. That's really wrong. But why are so many people backing them? Tell me why.
Well, because at the end, in that area, which is very poor, of course, whenever there is an inflow of resources, it's welcome. But at the same time, you have, as Vinicius Mariano rightly pointed out, to be very, very, very cautious. There has to be an investigation, and these people have to understand as well that what is being done is wrong. We talked about very briefly of the consequences of this illegal gold mining. They use mercury, quicksilver. This is highly polluting. It creates a number of difficulties and a number of very negative consequences for health. Just to give you an idea, in that area of the Amazon, the main source of animal protein is fish. If the rivers are polluted, you have the risk of these people being as well contaminated by this kind of substance. Right. So we have to be very careful. The government is being very careful. It is investigating, but at the same time, it has to act with determination to curb this kind of thing.
Yeah, and just a sort of side note, it's very difficult to confirm whether illegal miners have massacred previously uncontacted tribes. We're getting reports of that, and then there's some pushback saying this might not be true in the Javari Valley, so we'll have to watch that closely, but that would be a worrying development if true. Vinicius, how would you recommend the government acts in trying to find that balance? You have Ambassador França saying the government has to be very careful here. There's a lot of things to balance. On the one hand, sure, gold mining. It'll be good for the economy, legally, commercially, and so on. On the other hand, protecting the environment in a time when the climate is tenuous, and also protecting indigenous people who just want to be left alone. How does it do all of those things at the same time and fight illegal miners in that process?
This is a good question and a hard one to answer. As it is a complex subject, I think the most important point here is to listen to many actors that are involved in this question. It's not a question that the government can decide by its own, but indigenous people must be involved in this decision making, as well as people that are living in this region and need to find a way of surviving. I agree with Ambassador França that this position of the government, it must be well balanced to prevent the assassination of indigenous people by illegal miners, and also to preserve the environment, to preserve the nature in this region. It's important to remember that mining, it's a very expensive activity when well done, when properly done, and can convert very easily in a really disaster to the environment. So an increment of the fiscalization of companies or even individuals that are mining, it's very important. The regulation of the mining process, which areas can be used for mining or not, the preservation and protection of the indigenous areas and the reserves for environmental issues also must be assured. As well as the intensification of the presence of the states in this region. It's good to remember Humaitá, it is very, very isolated area in the heart of the Amazon, not far from Rondônia state. It's not so easy to connect to other parts of Brazil. The presence of the state there must be more efficient in prevent violent reactions as these one.
But Vinicius, when you say the intensification of the state presence, right? And when I mentioned to Paulo França earlier on that thousands of people had protested on behalf of the miners, he said, yeah, of course, if you're a poor villager and there's a cash bonanza and these illegal miners start to give you nice things now out of the blue, you might support them. Doesn't that tell you that perhaps if you have more of a state presence, particularly when it comes to police and military, they will be treated as an outside occupying force if the people's hearts are not with you?
Well, state presence should not be seen only as police and armed forces, but also must be understood as the presence of healthcare, education, infrastructure construction. So if those populations are not seen integrated into the main picture of the country as producers, as citizens, will be easier a way to confront that with the state. But if they feel integrated and part of a system that's called the state, we will not have here a problem. So I think, of course, the presence of the police and the armed force to prevent and really to fight the illegal and the criminal mining in this region, it's important. But other agents or other agencies of the state must be present too in order to assure that the entire community will be integrated into the country.
Mm-hmm. Good to see Paulo França nodding in agreement here. So I won't ask you if you agree, because I know you agree. Unfortunately, I've got to move on, but I'm really grateful that we've had this conversation because the story hasn't been in the headlines. And I'm glad to get both your thoughts on this issue in the Amazon. Paulo França and Vinicius Mariano de Carvalho, I thank you very much for joining us on the Newsmakers. NATO and the United States are sending 3,000 more soldiers to Afghanistan. It's a number that some generals on the ground call wildly insufficient to combat the country's worsening security situation. But their concerns, they say, are being ignored. Reports indicate that Europe's leaders are tired of a conflict they consider outside the scope of NATO's mission, at a time when Russia continues to threaten Eastern Europe. In a moment, I'll speak to a former member of the Afghan government on what this means for his country. But first, this report by Shoaib Hassan.
It's a war NATO forces thought they were almost done with. But now they are ramping it back up.
The current level is around 13,000. The new level will be around 16,000. They will train, assist and advise. And in particular, we are focusing on training the Afghan Special Operation Forces, which have proven so key in the fight against the insurgents, the terrorists, the Taliban.
The boost comes despite the reluctance of alliance members like Germany to join the mission. Still, the alliance agreed to support President Donald Trump's decision to raise US soldiers in Afghanistan by 10,000. There are currently 11,000 US soldiers in Afghanistan. They mostly provide backup to the 350,000 members of the Afghan National Army. That's in the form of US air power and special forces support. That's in contrast to the 13,000 NATO soldiers who are engaged in non-combat roles. The increase will raise the total strength of foreign soldiers to 37,000, which is still far less than the 100,000 combat soldiers deployed in 2011. That surge targeted the Taliban militants who had taken over large parts of the country and was able to take back those areas. But the Afghan National Army has since failed to hold them. Key areas across Afghanistan continue to fall to the Taliban. And the emergence of Daesh has put greater pressure on Afghan forces. They say they're increasingly under siege and need international help. Top US military leaders agree.
We're not winning in Afghanistan right now, and we will correct this as soon as possible. I believe the three things we are asking for stand on their own merit, however, as we look more broadly at the protection of the country.
It's in line with that advice that President Trump now has a more proactive Afghan policy. It's also put pressure on NATO to do more. But will their latest moves be enough to combat the growing strength of the Taliban and of Daesh in Afghanistan? Shoaib Hassan, The Newsmakers.
Well, I'm joined now from Washington by the former Afghan Minister of Commerce and Industry, Anwarul Haq Ahadi. Sir, thank you very much for joining us on The Newsmakers. I'm not going to call it a troop surge, but I guess it's an injection of 3,000 NATO forces. Are they going to be making a difference at all?
I'm not sure that the number itself would make really that much difference. I think the intentions or the policy whereby the United States committed itself not to withdraw forces before security situations are satisfactory, I think that would make a difference. I think the perception was that, and I think that perception was supported by some experts, that without strong international support, there was the danger of the Afghan state collapsing the way it collapsed in the 1990s, and I think that would have been catastrophic for everyone involved. But with the new commitment from the United States and I would say NATO, I think that the Afghan state has a strong chance of survival and and this move would make a difference.
Yeah, and you say good intentions and you say commitment, and I'm sorry to fixate on numbers, but there was a time when there were good intentions and a lot of commitment, plus more than 100,000 troops trying to do what the troops are doing right now, yet they failed. The Taliban only grew, and now they have almost half the country. So what makes you think that just a fraction of that amount of troops are going to turn the tide this time around and prevent the collapse of the Afghan state?
I don't think that the additional forces will enable the Afghan government and NATO forces really to crush the Taliban. I think that objective is to make them realize that probably the Taliban, that they cannot win either, and that should facilitate the way for a political settlement. In President Trump's announcement of the new strategy, he barely mentioned the political settlement, but subsequently Secretary Tillerson and also General Nicholson, I think as late as just a few days ago, he mentioned it, that the objective is to have political settlement. And I think that new intention and that commitment, well, rationally speaking, should persuade the other side that perhaps they cannot win either. I'm not saying that with 3,000 additional forces that the Afghan side or the government side or the NATO side would win, but I think that the other side would realize that they are not going to win either.
Well, but doing the maths and looking at the timeline of 16 years, so they were expelled from power, and then they wait it out. They fight an insurgency, and over a period of 16 years, despite tens of thousands and even more than 100,000 troops from all over the world, led by the world's greatest superpower, trying to stop them, they incrementally, town by town, city by city, province by province, gain more and more influence. If they're willing to wait it out, then you might have a political settlement, but it will be on their terms, right? So goodbye democracy, goodbye women's rights, goodbye average human rights for Afghans, because the Taliban will be back in town, right?
Well, I hope not. I hope not. I think that there will have to be some concessions made from the government side, from the international coalition's side. But I hope it's not goodbye to democracy, human rights, and women's rights. As a matter of fact, I have had a chance to talk with Taliban, and they are not insisting on not holding elections or not allowing women to go to school or to work. I think there is some change on their side as well. I think the problem in the past few years has been that the other side, the Taliban side, probably they thought that they can win, that they can wait for a little bit longer. If the U.S. were to withdraw its forces in 2014, 2016, then they could have prevailed. With the new strategy, I'm saying that I think they'll have a new calculation of the situation, and I hope that they'll be led to the conclusions that perhaps a political solution is in the best interest of everyone involved. As I said, I'll repeat this, I'm not sure that the government or the international forces will prevail militarily completely, especially with the entrance of new actors such as Iran's support for Taliban, Russia's support for Taliban, and the old Pakistan support for Taliban. They can prolong this war. But on the other hand, if they don't have any hope of winning, it would be quite irrational on their part as well to prolong this war. Right now, they are suffering as well. Their casualties have increased. I admit that the casualty on the part of the government, that has increased too, but from the other side, their casualties are increasing as well.
You say that the Russians, the Iranians, and the Pakistanis are supporting the Taliban. If they're watching this, what's your message to them?
Well, I hope that, they all identify as to what is it exactly that they want in Afghanistan. I mean, if the Russian side, if their concern is to prevent Daesh, I think the best way to prevent the spillover of Daesh into Central Asia would be to have a stable Afghanistan. If the Iranians also, if they are concerned with Daesh, I think a stable Afghanistan would help them as well. And we need to ask Pakistan really to make serious decisions as to what is the critical demands that they would like to make. Unfortunately, I mean, as I said earlier, there was a bare mention of the political solution in President Trump's statements, and the subsequent statements, even though they indicate greater willingness to engage in political dialogue, there has been no principles of political dialogue have been identified as to what are the issue and what can be done. I can see that probably it's a little bit early for the participants, for the official participants to declare their position, but at least the non-governmental institutions, the intellectuals, they should have peace talk as to what should be the principles of negotiations. What are the do's and don'ts, what are the red lines for various sides, and what are the common factors. As I said earlier, that if the Taliban do not insist on preventing girls from going to school, if they do not insist on women have the right to participate in political process as well as to have a job, and if they don't, if they allow elections, then I think we could make some progress in this regard. I think what's needed is really to have this kind of discussion, if not directly between the official participants, at least between the non-official actors, to identify these issues and to determine as to what are the deadlines and where we can agree with each other.
Very finally, do you trust Ashraf Ghani's leadership?
I don't. Unfortunately, I don't think he has handled the peace process very well. I don't think he's handling the military situation very well. I'm supportive of the fact that he has, close coordination of military efforts with the international community, with NATO. But I think one of the major problems is that he is so unpopular. His government is highly ineffective. It's a highly dishonest government. Its legitimacy is seriously under question. And I'm not sure he's really committed to clean politics, to clean elections. And therefore, we have to live with him for another 15, 16 months. But I hope that he will not stay in power beyond that. And I hope that there will be a more sincere leadership that can handle the process well as that have a greater commitment to peace, but at the same time have strong values that will have some red lines that which will not be violated by that administration. I don't believe that Dr. Ghani is that kind of a person.
Okay, Anwar al-Haq Ahadi, it's been a pleasure talking to you on the Newsmakers. I thank you very much for joining us. That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. You can check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Remember to like, follow and subscribe. Next time, Daesh's self-proclaimed caliphate is on the verge of collapse. Is the group's reign of terror coming to an end? Until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.